Mare, that already in Namja, Shujeda, Li, Nandegi, Namja, Yamninja, Judochi, said the Judochi, and Yamninja, kind of show, said it right down. They gave a Yamlin kind of show, and me gave a lady, why there's some kind of Tamore said. And it's other one to a listener, name gave a Latine, and it would take you, and they gave a take to more. And me give a Latine, table to my Gorba, in Enza, that in Zadu, where I get Tiwadi cover it, to my Migo Venza, that do I give you Megawadi Atoyata, and the Tiwadi you Gewadi to Viadi, in Enza on to Senator or as a tea or ma, is a man that penetrates with his son, what Miguel and Miguel my chung, Dele Chitter, and Trangishe, in Zentado, Dagi in ye, Dini Percy Summergy, at Dinny, all those Tinanja dinner, gave you chalky, Hamji Tawa Merber to be songs. They are Zawa need Lemon Jevo. Here, Tawani, Lemon Jevo, Combe saw said it on the Cassent in the Shura. It is that Rajelia, at Dinigi, Lake in the Sam Nana Corban, isn't it sure?
Good evening. So we've been looking at the presentation on cause and effect or karma for some time. And we've come to one of the final outlines, having contemplated karma's effects, how to engage in virtue and desist from non-virtue. So we've come to recognize through this presentation that the happiness that we've enjoyed thus far and that we seek all comes about in dependence on causes. So too, the suffering that we wish to avoid and we have had to endure thus far, it too comes about in dependence on causes. Understanding this then, it's imperative that we take this knowledge and we integrate it deeply within so that it's not a mere intellectual knowledge that's something we've heard before and we know and we accept, but rather something that actively changes how we think and therefore how we behave. Because we all want to experience happiness and be freed of suffering. This here then is the presentation on what those causes are to accumulate for happiness and what are those to abandon because they will lead to suffering. And last time we looked at 2 verses from the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. So it's in the middle of page 142. Suffering arises from non-virtue. How can I definitely gain liberation from it? It is appropriate day and night always to contemplate nothing but this. The sage taught that resolute faith is the root of all virtues, and the root of that is to meditate continuously on fully ripened effects.
Karna Belies, Carbo City, Kiviles, or now it's Migivile Tsure. Chesada to do Chindambo, and Kivile, and Migivile, Denishina Kavari, teaching the Migaris, and Chazan, Lunga, when you go to Tanti Hako, and Lunga, when you Mikawa Salan Hako, then how when it and Kivile Latin to and Devadi Tiki, Migivile Latin to my said, Oducindi, Yane, and Shimuchi Chabache, Combachas, Yane, and Comsedida. 借我们的时候，或者在安那些的用在上大，对那都是那样的光顾的事情，我对这说了，你这在的那个因为呢，信度高度具备，哎吧，那前年把那个位置了，现在的连这些的其他么的，这个信度呢，参谋的其他那些超话些，他们对连了我好过对，刚才考我瞧的是信度高度些的，其实的信度高度些的，我这个用在上大呢，这个。 하고 마투 에트 세우다 고토요 신도고 디가르스네 산지이 룽코나레 때네 이시제 케링고 녀바녀고 인자 엘레 에네냐고 데 제네케 레게네 체지 타와디 신도고 yes.
And after those 2 verses, Lama Tsongkhapa commented by saying that it's imperative that one comes to understand the presentations on virtuous and non-virtuous karma, and understand, coming to having understood what constitutes virtuous and non-virtuous karma. One needs to reflect on this with analytical meditation repeatedly over a sustained period, coming to understand one's way of thinking and seeing one's way of thinking and the subsequent physical and verbal behavior through the lens of what is virtuous and what is non-virtuous karma, so that one can have confidence that one is striving in the abandonment of non-virtue and the accumulation of excellent virtuous karmic imprints. Moreover, Lama Tsongkhapa said that to understand the complexities of karma in fine detail is very difficult for us to do. In fact, it's not possible for us to understand the fine workings of karma because it is an extremely hidden phenomenon, which means that for non-Buddhists, one cannot rely on reasoning to come to understand the precise, the subtle workings of karma. Our reasoning capacity is insufficient. Therefore, for a more general understanding of karma, certainly we can utilize analytical meditation. But for the fine detail, there one needs to rely on the teachings of the Buddha.
Dan sabon dodo koronun diye yu kiye nüba kanış yorasede yani ancak o şeşin şey yapıyor. Sabon lüteni macda bana nügu kiyo batın ada ha gugore. Yine nügu dodo dinale nügu kiye nüba kanış yorasede tin ancak kale habore de anzı bir kale habore ya şimdi seni bana korucu ya di o dini ke san tele zeden juna yu tensi getör ti chamene ki marasede. Dan yani 그런데 심지어 야고 제행이 체리버 걸어서 하고 말은 안 주게다 하고도 말았다. 이내 마사본에 따른 딜기기 여바도 라바라바다 하고 오네. 기회들이야 니버 간스 구글에 간스 기기에 있어야지 당은 하고도 말다 딜에 차와 차서로와. 어디서 안 주게 라바라바디게 지단 치 현재기 유래되네 제부기와 유바디 가서 라바라바디 이거 하고 올바다.
To give an illustration of what we can, as ordinary people, understand and what is beyond our capacity right now. So, for example, we all know that if we plant a specific seed in the right kind of soil with the right conditions, such as warmth and moisture, then that seed will sprout. And if it continues to have various causes met, then the sprouts will grow. And eventually the plants will be fully mature and even bear fruit. So this we know, it's within our realms of reasoning to be taught this and to understand this. So this level from this cause comes this effect, needs these ripening conditions. This is within our capacity. But there is a subtler level of working of cause and effect that is beyond the common understanding of the average person. And that is what is the capacity, or what is it about that seed that actually ripens? What is the potency or the capacity of that seed to ripen? Now, therefore, possibly all of us, or the majority of us in this room, we don't really know, but certainly botanists who have studied this well, they will be able to give a long discourse on what the capacity or the potency of a seed is that leads it to sprouts when it meets the right conditions into that particular plant. So for them, those experts in the field, they can see subtler workings of cause and effect that for the majority of people is just beyond our capacity.
Andan yunde saydi da kevile sayda kevile sayda teletine tibu tiki yungures migevile teletine tibu tunga yungures saydi da deso kevile da migevile sayda ngazu migi toyayo marwa migi toyayo marta lagui reyayo marwa 제가 데니에 자다 한도 기회에 사 두시네 심주지 제바제 야네 야도 데니지 곧 담보 쳐바제 데니티네 삼로 데니 담베네 Tele, energy layers in it, that been some Tata Nale, yes, some Toa, Dushi, Semba, Ilaja, Yapasa, some not so slew. Dinner that, yes, at the Kagiri, that's simply Semba the day said. She's not doing Shimjushina, or is the Tambo Tuba, Tubi, the Negayana, some Tadin, the nigger, some no call decent Semba the Kiri, the essay. On the Latin end, Jewwood, Yungore, setting on Jugi, Dushin, Tuba, Tubi, Tunnel, Yane, and some the Gumje, some the Dushin, Jay the lake, leg, Delatin, that you would give you a day, a Sigores, as some Lutane, some Lutane, Denich, like Sem Semba, Sem Semba the lady. Tikewachi nada, Kevile, Dite Mauba Tiki Hungary. That the Migawachina, the Mikavili, Simu Semba. That Dite would do my Hungary said, down to Duchin and Simush, some Chevache, in it, Duchin Alco, Chagua, that did, in a what it was Rabaji down.
The presentation on karmic cause and effect is primarily looking at virtuous karmic causes that lead to virtuous or happy ripening results, and non-virtuous karmic causes that lead to non-virtuous or suffering results. So this is something that for us we can come to an intellectual understanding of based on teachings and our own reflection based on those teachings. But it's something that's difficult for us to actually perceive how the workings of karma are. But again, by utilizing our intelligence through hearing and then through thinking about or reflecting on what we've heard, we can come to some understanding. Moreover, when we are taught where actually it is that karma is created, we can come to understand that it is one particular consciousness or a mental factor of intention. It is that is actually karma. So therefore, we can come to an understanding that it's our intention, if it's virtuous or non-virtuous, that will determine whether it is a virtuous or non-virtuous karmic imprint that is accumulated. And it is that imprint that will later ripen into either a desired result or an undesired result. And got your lemna, the lap cobucha. Chesa Lee Gundig do some how go in any delatin march mutuated at Yawangama, consume Chimakans to go recipe, the good in the sun can you go as to touch out which Shimjucheva Chevated, any cumula samtane, give a Chima Yubago to work, give a Chima Yubawana, then Chimati Chingamadi Yubago. That's with the topics of the Dharma. One requires extensive hearing or study of the topic, and whilst going through this process of gathering knowledge, one also engages in a continuous process of reflecting or contemplating that topic. In this way, one comes to understand it better. And here, as one comes to understand the workings of karma better, this also aids one's understanding of past and future lives. In fact, if one does not accept past and future lives, one cannot come to a good understanding of karma. But these two understandings, though, are mutually dependent in that, are interdependent in that as one's understanding of one grows, it aids the understanding of the other, particularly in terms of as we understand that this life has come about independence on causes, we recognize that those causes had to have been accumulated in a life previous to this. Similarly, the causes we are creating in this life, they will lead to the ripening result of a future rebirth. So these two, cause and effect, and past and future lives, they have an interdependent, a mutually dependent relationship.
야네 양도 제바지 안에 양도 제 금제 삼다 안에 도신 제하죠. 근데 야네 양도 제바치도 얘네기는 하워야디 아니지 야야야 도리 얘네자 잉밀레젤 냥바니 오다텐데 예군이스도 선비게 냥바 칭이리에 성크라.
We concluded last time with Lama Tsongkhapa stating that one needs to meditate on the karmic cause and effect again and again, repeatedly over a sustained period, so that certainty arises. And certainty isn't just, yes, I know it's true. Certainty is that it has a profound and lasting impact on our behavior. Then one has certainty, where one has an inner obstacle to engaging in non-virtue and an open embrace to engaging in virtue. This is the sign of being certain about the workings of cause and effect, not just a mere acceptance. And this one needs to come to meditating again and again on the topic.
And the Shindu Kogyo Imba, since I never Yana Kalapabu resident, the Shindu Kogyo resident, Kursungoras and Dondalata, and you get Java Jago Matum, that you summaris may tell them the Hokiwa, Masaji is over to the Sanji Yishi or Esorta, Saji in New York, Kiwi and the Migo, Tuan and Kasakiwi Lela, then Tewan Yungre, and the Miki Lela, and Tumayungre, Saji, Passon Shepherd, Alien number Sun Yapatelia, Tajidu. 이시시오고리에서 왔다가 저단다리 이시시오고리 이시 맞아봐나 안저기 네 도마투 하고 마투나다 이 여사마레 다다이 사마레 삼나 지고 말이 체단디네다다 이시시오고리에서 신도 고게 다 사예기 이치별 롱코나를 때에 디제스 타조고에 차고레스.
All topics of the Dharma require repeated meditation. This topic, though, also requires a deep trust in the Buddha and therefore the Buddha's teachings, because this is a topic that is included amongst those which are extremely hidden, which again, the meaning is one cannot gain complete certainty in it only through intellectual reasoning. One also requires faith or trust in the Buddha's teachings, because it is beyond our capacity to intellectually come to abandon every uncertainty. So the only way to overcome uncertainty is through or through the combination of analytical meditation based on study, as well as a deep and profound trust in the Buddha.
띵예진 개보리스 다와 karma 제반 네 동신스 네 리당 정도 제베 서시바 남게 감네 넘버 신규경 괜히 미뎀바 이치미소 셰풍바 알았어.
So now we turn to the text, to new material, and here Lama Tsongkhapa quotes from the King of Concentration Sutras, and the overall topic remains that of developing a profound and heartfelt trust in the words of the Buddha. So at the bottom of page 142, even if the moon and stars were to fall, the earth were to collapse with its mountains and towns, and the heavenly realms were to utterly change, still no word you have spoken would be untrue.
That is Sanyelia Devaru Shedwa, Chisada de Karsmars and the Dawa Karma and Chela ne Dongxing Siduda, Chisada Dawada Gama Dige, that ma Designadash and the Dawada Gama di Dawadige ma Sach Selma Sasi, Gama di Selma Sasi, that Dala Dawada Gama and to do Skorakadu. Dawa didan somebody in the top secrets or Tabiagi yon secrets, Karma dan and somebody need pat Tabiagi yon secrets or that need conscious. Karma Dawa Jeva need conscious. Tis that Karma Korongi Dawa Koran Duset Dilepa to Dachet, to Chanel Dorje, Salit, Tumbling Salayat, Tungres, Tung Siltat, Tafset, I have Gures. Then Karma di Yokoron, Karma di Duset Inema, 10 part Sarch and telling Koran. 되었을 말이와 저 둘레신 한점을 사사 아리아 도신 인터넷 답변 시리에서 올다 시리에서 까마 다와 까마 제반이 동신세
This verse from Sutra is a praise to the Buddha. Look at the first line, even if the moon and stars were to fall. So in other words, if the moon or the stars in the sky were to fall from their usual abode and collide with the earth, that would be the meaning of the first line. And so if the moon and stars were to fall from their abode in the skies and crash into the earth, now the second line, leading to the collapse of mighty mountains and all surrounding towns.
남게 감네 넘버를 현유 가서 남가 동버디야 나 감션 넘버 현유 교교 인하서 그러다 지단 남가디 교요마 교요 따바라고 교요 교요 저에서 말고 다 교신 거고 교요마 교요마데 계시 교요 인하서 그러다 이세 그러다 남게 감네 넘버 현유 가서 계시 남게 감데 봐 유르체 현지 뭐 버서 교요 인하 교야이나 이네 교와 있나요? 괜히 믿음바이 치미송사 상기 교기 가수가 덴바데 마도 그런 게 믿음바 치기는 술 말에 사실
된다 그뒤 가면 야마다 다와기 됐어.
이제 남가 동바 바나 동바는 남가 세들이 바나 동 어디로 왔다는 건데 까마 남다 남가 가려로 어디로 남가 아직 남게 감 동바 토레 가서 이 메가 됐어요.
And into the third line, and the heavenly realms were to utterly change. So the heavenly realms, or literally it's the sky or space. So this is considered a permanent phenomenon. So even if a permanent phenomenon were to change, that's the third line.
제가 남게 까마 되게 남카데 지다 유어줘요 말티 이나 계시 디니 유어줘 있나요? 상계 결혼기 덴바르마도 직 미데마 주인의 송말에 사실. 이 괜히 죄세 상계세월에 미데베 직미소서 결혼기 강송바디다 한젤레 레카나딘 요르송와데 덴바짱자마도 미데베 특기의 송말에.
So if all of these remarkable things were to happen, the moon and the stars were to fall and collide with the earth, causing the mountains to collapse and the towns to be destroyed, and the unchanging, or the meaning of permanent, unchanging heavenly realms actually changing, then the final line, still no word you as the Buddha Shakyamuni, have spoken would be untrue. So even if all these inconceivable things were to happen, still the Buddha would not have said anything that were untrue.
나와 나가마 되게 안주 남자들 곧배 지게 기내 메디어 그런 다른 되어로 시로데 이나디 님치 바살 발동사다 zamleya tabada in the yon sigiri said this yon sivaro kamada 다와디게 zamleya 답시브 투 시바로 다 남게 감디게 다 교어줘야 요 말이 때 이내 계시 교어도 요가 있나요? 근데 사이 결혼 게 송들래 템바리마도 요기래 요 말 좀 중기대 써야만 템바 can자레스 소요도 다 가질래 사이 숨어들 이체 받다다 다 될이 까마다 님마 다월 자기 말했어야 돼 이치메 세월다 이치메디 사시기레스 남게 감 유어 두고 말했어야 돼 유어 드시기레 시베 있나나 시베 있나야 사이 숨 결혼데 템바can야 숨마다 주인 숨마레 제다디 될이야 사이 숨어야 될 이체 타지리 세월다 도나 도신이 이치 제고 그래서 우리 나신제네.
So just to summarize, if the highly unlikely but conceivable the moon falling and crashing to Earth, or stars colliding with the Earth, and causing the mountains to collapse and towns to be destroyed, whilst this is conceivable, highly unlikely, but were the conceivable but highly unlikely to happen, the Buddha would still have said nothing that is untrue. And if the inconceivable, a unchanging phenomenon, sky or space, if this were to change, so if the inconceivable, the impossible, were to happen, even then, nothing that the Buddha has spoken would be untrue.
Dinezan Chesung Batar, Dinen Jerem Jakaras Musane, the Jinshibu Sungla Yicheber Chelas, Tel Yisheba Jela, Yang Tes. She's not Sayi Sunglia, then Sayi, Dene late in the Tin Cheban, Tebo Dinichungure, Tebo Dinich, Tetele, Dinicheban, Tebo Dinistungure, so Atilia, Yishore, so that's Suki Chebache, how go not Seming about ye, Seming about money by another. That's also Seming about my and other Sanyi Sunja, Demba in the Mina. Demba you matters and big some do stag your matters. So you get a leg into do so at the Shimbuche Chebache, so the Siming ever never and that easily grow up. This is Chebache Shimja how moto when what that is science, then you matters and big this sometime your mother, but Sanyi so Tahara, yes, we each other, yes, each jealous. All the easy you could do each year says your what is each or some year fair delay. Tahara in you is each or less.
In Lama Tsang,
Each said mother each year. The Lord do each year see what dimmer. Each said, naturally each year says no what in the minute. I could do each made a good shield that's as your Timber naturally each year said, or dinner is Sanjay somebody. So you get somebody's I lay you Jeba Shimbu sending ever near by now, the Tahara. Sending ever money by that she do go getting ever near to go, money was that say you saw the Tahara, yes, and easy killing or this one.
then Lama Tsongkhapa continues with his commentary. You should thus develop conviction in the words of the Tathagata and maintain it. The conviction here, of course, refers to causes and their effects. So through hearing, repeatedly hearing teachings and reflecting on what one is hearing, then one should give rise to a deep and abiding trust. So, but it's difficult for us to give rise to a direct valid cognition in relation, or to a valid cognizer in relation to the presentation and cause and effect. But whilst it's difficult to give rise to valid cognition, we certainly can overcome our doubts or our hesitation through hearing and reflecting, and through also a deep conviction in the validity of the Buddha's teachings. We thereby can give rise to a deep trust that what is presented as the causes that lead to suffering is a valid presentation, and the causes that lead to happiness is a valid presentation.
And that in the young up in ours, which is Suzuki, never Roshi, and it is there don't have to go that take all that object or current chapter in the nation, and they don't have to go say, Ma take all that penny, Teniki chapter into an Lama, Hada Lama, Telia, so Lama, Alaya, so at the chapter into the Chavina, Yoradic, and come and say, Saji, somewhere in that down to give. Not never a child, and they say to another chapter and together. Then you got them declare never the matters in never she to a Ungurwa and Ungurwa. And then the other ones who are some oh, that chapter and two is never Tamas or Chesa chapter and to Keotum, Lam Sangelia, the Nitaba check out to win never Taris did it, then they mean to Ishimino, the Tamas, she saw some big and Ungurwa there. Bendigo, just that dinner sometimes the Shapden Dubje, and a con never Shapden Dubje, the changes your hammer, what thank you, Homer, as a call of pen, I'm having a dog, mother. She's in a penny, she uses them a penny. You're right. Just that dinner some and dinner some toning or you get. I thought that the Shapden do not think you said the pen into the Atisha as a big image. Yeah, the witch and I do not young cigarette. 네, 가시 심지어 소주진의 เป็น통잡유도 배주 배하고 차야 돼 연구를 와서 그때 못한 배주하고 차. 그래서 다 디베체나 동화 연구를 하는지 세디야 dimba민도 선비게 다 다다민도 선비게 되는 연구를 와서 돼. 그래서 디리에 제보딩하자 고투고 말. 제가 저 작가의 통도 어디 디에서 선비 삼는 다제. 안되는 이 맞춰봐. 용시고래. 제가 디네자데 Bendigo told him, Shimya watch how crotchet. Chesa Yana and Gongul Yana and Chebachi, Kim the Samda, 하고 제 대지 한목원에 산이 순에 이시시고 제 뒤송.
Sometimes when people face an obstacle such as illness, they will approach a teacher that they have faith in and request for some prayers or for puja to be done for them. And the teacher may well give advice and say, yes, you need to do this practice or sponsor these pujas and so forth. And having faith in the teacher that they, from their side, approached, then they may well follow that advice and either follow it themselves or sponsor some pujas. But let's say they don't heal, or the person they are requesting prayers for does not heal. So then they may well say, the Lama doesn't know what they're talking about, or the prayers have no power. So they may well have some kind of response like that. But the truth is, whether the person actually healed or not, we cannot say with complete certainty that the healing came from that cause or the lack of healing was because of the fault in the puja. This is something we cannot say with complete certainty. So, and another illustration would be, so we know from non-virtue comes suffering. So this is taught very clearly. We know killing is non-virtuous and leads to suffering. But then there are some people who kill, perhaps butchers with big abattoirs. They do a lot of killing, and they are perhaps very wealthy. So this can lead to some doubts arising, that we see all this non-virtue being committed, and yet the person is living a financially very comfortable life. And the truth of the matter is, when it comes to the finer workings, even on that level, in the way that's been described, is pretty coarse. Even there, we cannot see the direct relationship between a result and its causes. So therefore, we are very dependent in this topic on having faith in the Buddha and his teachings.
지사다 소식이 제바지 심야하고 토대 내바니 아모원에 고마도나 상유선데 템바레에서 이시 추천 남자 되네기 이 마체베 제베나다 레이컨델리아 로파타와 차르고 로아치 팅님의 침바사야 그냥 아이로 해서다 상유선이 소마데 신도 고교 참무디 영한자 하고 두고 말에 테마도 원자 상예 강송받는 따라리 스비 이시셔가 되겠지 모르겠어 지나다 이체벌자라 장대에서도 장세 두선 장세 라렌다 그래서데 제사장의 이시체저 따라리 이시체 있는 냐면 제고래서다.
Just reading the sentence again. You should thus develop conviction in the words of the Tathagata and maintain it. So developing conviction in the words of the Tathagata, this comes about through studying the teachings and reflecting on the teachings in general. And as one comes to see the validity of those that one really can observe for oneself, it will make it much easier to accept those teachings as being completely valid, those that are extremely hidden, that we cannot establish through reasoning. So in this way, as one develops a deep faith in the Buddha's teachings through one's own spiritual development, then those teachings which are extremely hidden, such as this topic, one will develop deep and abiding faith in it. In the final part of the sentence, and maintain it, this refers to that this is an ongoing process, that through one's own spiritual journey, one's own spiritual development, one's faith in the Buddha and the Buddha's teachings, this will become ever more stable.
단디라 주민이 내바 마녀나 최가라야 자와기비 내바 미니도스.
Lama Tsongkhapa continues, unless you have gained uncontrived certainty about them, you will not gain the certainty that pleases the victors about any Dharma teachings.
디네 자다 딜라스데 레이군데 텔시오 레이군데 남샤 텔이야 제마 민바시 녀바시 녀고레스 에네치키베 타치바 디레스베 타치베 녀바 녀고레스 디니 마녀 바이나 최가라야 자와기비기 녀바 미니도스네 최냐면 그렇체베나 디네 서치kem 사예유 투 녀기 냠멘디야 고시용 투 마레스야 치군.
unless you have gained uncontrived certainty about them. So them then refers to the presentation and cause and effect. So if one still doesn't have uncontrived certainty about the presentation on cause and effect, even though one makes great efforts in some other aspect of the Dharma, this one still will not yet be pleasing the victors.
그래서 당 저기 근데 저기 리 근데 디피리 제반의 미가 용구를 선비게 해봐 타지도 상당히 해봐있나 근데 디피리 대해서 동아 미디어 봐인자 동아 유교 디피리를 점거로 와치다다 나고 거네 디피치야를 점야 빈진 참아치도 나게 파지 어디 진셰베네 디피리 디기티고 뭐보다 강한 동아 유구에서 진 참아치도 가셔베네 디바레스 그 유관에 안에 지게 이 소주발에 마침발렘바 매송하지발라 소바티체바는 디거리 제사디 마오번데 도와용 것을 어디 디시겨 말세 쳔야다 얘네 이 유관에 하지 사야디 두천체바는 제사디네기 계지 디비게 남차디 없습니다 딜레트네 제부 도와용 그래 선비게 직 타지도 녀바르지 타지도 이시 제바이나 어디디 마오번데 도와 미디어바인자 얘네게 삼나다지 안디 파제미알이야 직 수좀 써야 누가에서 예주 dombe기 수좀 써야야 한도 쉬운 거 봐. 좀 거 봐. 진짜 디 젬바 있는데 개와사 용 거 봐. 개와사 거 봐. 진짜 디 개와사인데 니 제고 디겨 때니 디 수바 있나? 개와래. 개와 디 수바 있나? 니 맞지 맞지. 시 송토바 있나? 개와래. 개와이나? 디 제고 뭐 봐나 동하 디지 가서 대화 지금 그래 선배기. 진짜 다 디네사 수식이 대화 되어봐리 동하 미디어 봐인다. 동하 미용이 된다라. 일루메스 예주 덤비 domyana ane chik diadio by the devi to be ego and denig dungas ni chum soya deke ane yapochon to gorwa denig yapochon ba ina denig yawa devi and yawa geva chawra to nigro at outside ne saji korongi on the cheten body the yamlen cheata lalen taiga to na sungbore and the yamlen cheba ina and the dungale tache 대화니 대화야 조투고르바 사이에 미유 디르와 제레자 먼저 두스치네 삼다냠네 제반 사이 투기고 어당이 도슬랍체 남된 바나지 코드 냠네 빼야고 중도 선비 다 사는 게 도스치네 그 공부시 예 녀바 중고를 해서 제산되네 녀바 무리스 이네게다 삼마다제 다직 대응적이 최대지 남 최치 위에서 최켈레라체 최지거는 다다마제베젠 유아이스니 디바야 고마송바이나 데네가제 사이니 말와 등이도선 타브란텐도 스템바리즈 코즈디 힐렌지 도도지도 야고 지금도 선비게다 데네 연구로와 데네자다 제사 데네기 에버야고 삼단예네 데네파 르가이스니 제 돈바 추림디 야고 소바이나 네 사이 두비에바디 연구레스
The teachings on karma come down to from virtue, happiness follows, from non-virtue, suffering follows. And the presentation is, of course, as you know, more detailed than that, but in brief. And this is what we need to gain uncontrived certainty in. Because if one does not have uncontrived certainty that from non-virtue suffering follows, and then what constitutes non-virtue, one will not abandon non-virtue. One will continue to lie and to gossip and to talk badly about others, perhaps physically also to take life. And eventually one will have thoughts of covetousness and harmful intent and so forth. Whereas on the other hand, if one does have certainty about cause and effect, that certainty will be experienced as maybe you could say like an inner firewall against such behavior. It will be inconceivable to oneself to lie, to gossip, to engage in divisive speech, and so forth. And this, then, is the cultivation of the ethical restraint of abandoning the 10 non-virtues. It is the very foundation for spiritual development. And it's from this foundation that all other good qualities can be developed. And we can, again, develop these causes that will lead to ongoing happiness and ever fewer problems, suffering, and difficulties in our life. And in this way, we are helping the Buddhas fulfill their objective or their goal, because the very goal of the Buddha in teaching the Dharma is to guide beings from their current state of suffering through the process of mental transformation, which is the abandonment of the causes for suffering and the wholehearted embrace of the causes for happiness, and thereby progress towards and eventually attain freedom from suffering. So therefore, when one has genuine, uncontrived certainty in the presentation on cause and effect, one then has that foundation for one's spiritual development and progression towards lasting happiness. This then is what delights the Buddhas, because their heartfelt wish is being fulfilled by seeing another suffering being slowly turning their back on the causes of suffering and embracing those causes for happiness.
Andan dushine da denege da gewa di dipa se de migewa chikyo mares gewa du bore se je sonya sonya de andala anjuge yajik anjuge chudim yamle cheore jimbe yamle je sebe yamle je pajin duge yamle cheore set sonya sungore je sungda chudim sungore lunga is yeshi de chudim sungore se sungorwa ndi dondala karasne ande le kunde sungore se donda chiba chegore 가르스는 예균을 써야 돼 가르스는 디벨이 지겨 말해 달원 디벨이 제만나 가르여 소죠 받아 마진 발레바 메사 줘봐 안데 주인 참아 치도 마캬라서 봐 나섬 니섬 로타케나 디벨이 그러와 제자디 디바 지겨마 디잼 고거라게도 디마지버서 송나 수림 거르바데 수림 거르바 제자 수림 거래 셋 수림 거라 제자 수림 거래 라비도 단다라 디벨이 지겨 말 송거르바 제자 송다로지 때 두스체네 권나 소게도네 님체 나소던데 donda chiba papsa chiba digido wa dis까지 donda ningbo de la ma ji denegi shani de dunga isumi yeche domyade 지산 di jeba ine 가르서 가르래 남나 di jeba ine di debu dunga 용고를 ngason 깨야 돼 아 저기 미가war래 되는 ngason 끼고 dunjol 깨야 돼 ngason 미래 미가war래 끼고 냐war래 깨야 돼레 미가war래 되는 끼고 때 nganroda nyawada nidala so kede migiwele tene ke di ne gaso dunga pa to mepa nyongwe de migiwele tene nyongo migiwele tene dunga nyongo ro anga je miri kede miri tenda dunga yo de migiwe kule tene migiwele tene dunga nyongo ro 제자다 인자 다 dunga migo ba sanga da nyawale ke mo nida nyawaide dunno ke wa de ke migo wa de de dunga nyongo 미르케바이나 하다 미르케바이나 동안요 무거워디 아니 가르가 제 오래라네 요 미가와디 까고리스 바카디 송고리스 제가 미가와 지겨 말에서 소야 디스무라 제가 미가와 지겨 말에 미가와디 하고와 제 미가와디 지겨 말에서 당한도 출연염은 출임 송고리스 제가 출임 송고리스 다 된다래 미가와 주어디 마치 지바리도 와디 된다 송다 가 된다 지바 책도 와디
In various teachings, the presentation will have differing emphasis or differing lists to present the causes to lead to a particular result. So sometimes one will hear about the causes that will lead to good rebirths of ethics, generosity, patience, joy, perseverance, or the causes for liberation, which would be those added with concentration and wisdom, and then other causes added to that to lead to Buddhahood. But what one sees through these varying lists is that they have ethics in there, because ethics is the very foundation for our spiritual development. And ethics in its most foundational presentation is the ethical restraint of the ethics of restraining one's physical behavior, one's speech, and one's mind. And what this comes down to is the presentation on cause and effect, because this presentation started first with a general presentation on karma, and then went straight into these 10 non-virtuous actions, those that are committed physically, verbally, and mentally, and then refraining from these, and in fact cultivating the determination never to engage in them. This is the ethical restraint of abandoning the 10 non-virtues, the very foundation for all spiritual training. Because none of us want to suffer. We all want to abide in happiness. The suffering which we don't wish to experience all comes about in dependence on causes. And the happiness we long for, it comes about in dependence on causes. So one needs to know what those causes are and strive to cultivate them. But in this process, the primary or the main focus has to be ensuring one does not fall to the lower realms. Because if one does not abandon the 10 non-virtues, and therefore a non-virtuous karmic imprint propels our next rebirth, it will be into the lower realms. Once born there, a being is lost to suffering. Their suffering is so intense in those lower realms, and their confusion and their pain is so intense that the possibility for spiritual development is completely lost for as long as they are there. So not wanting to suffer, we have to ensure we do not create the causes that lead to the lower realms. This is then to ensure we do not accrue the 10 non-virtues. But moreover, knowing that we want a good rebirth, at least as good as we have in this life, we have to accumulate virtuous causes, the ethics of abandoning the 10 non-virtues. So here we see how as a very foundation to ensure that we have ongoing rebirths and can continue our spiritual development, we need to train in this presentation on cause and effect. It will often, in various contexts, be presented as ethics. But what ethics comes down to was at its foundational level is this presentation of cause and effect.
Ada gewa dubure sede da gewa dubsedi nje gewa tene ndeki de yungo basa de gewa chima ngonde ko ma thoya de ya ngie gewa tene yungo re den de ngonde ko ma den de ya ndeki nyaa de ya gewe le gewa le tene to ku yungo ba andi ma je 탈바다 탐지 기비 고 고바토야 된 기위 염래 제바티 용 제가 디네 상은 저기 디기 되어봐 이제 디기 가와 디기 되어 하다 미고 고바토나 땡들라 디기 고고래 근데 대래 맞이 땡기 대와 탈바다 탐지 기비 고 토고 고래 제가 디 토야래야 근데 대서나서 디기 대서 디기 고고 요바나 이 근데 기위 레데 야고 송 오래 야고 두고 그래서 오라다나 대송 오르와다.
We all want to abide in happiness. And every time we have problems, we're reminded of how we want to abide in happiness. And every happy result, every desired result, comes about in dependence on virtue. So whether it's a good rebirth, good conditions in that rebirth, or ongoing spiritual development and the eventual liberation from cyclic existence, or even the attainment of Buddhahood, all of these excellent results come about in dependence on virtue. And the accumulation of virtue varies greatly. It can be of quite weak strength, can be of intermediate strength, and great strength. So this is all part of the same presentation on cause and effect. We need to understand well what is virtue and how to accumulate it, and accumulate it of a high quality so that it leads to powerful results.
아니 자다 레균제기 남자 성예를 빼마시 계심마도 레 담보조리야 이 사바도 레균의 남자의 계심무시고 차고를 시사 레균의 남자 성예를 빼 계심무 차고래스 인자다 야네 야도 공고리에서 이제 송거와.
Really want to emphasize how for us as beginners, this presentation on cause and effect is of the utmost importance. One may be drawn to other presentations, but this is the indispensable presentation. It runs throughout the entire Dharma. And this is what we need to develop deeply within us to accrue the causes for happiness and avoid the causes for suffering.
나스메 동아디게 셰데 냐와 세다 이다 세다 딘디르투마 냐위기다 냐완 냐함쪽게 세디네 셰네다 동아디네 요 셰바디 제산 디수 안솔레 디니스 디네 요르다 디스게 강아디네 요레 디 강아데 가르치 가르데리 무슨 미교레레 디네 용고레 제산 딘세 디 따트 아주 요모네 미교레디 바 치교 마레 케와투 고레 사시 가도나닝 보디 아주게 데시니엘 셰바디 디네 강아디 하고 디 모거나 안경 가르쳐 버려서 디셰고래 사지다 제고에 디셰고를 받아 디숭고로.
Couple of chapters before, we looked at a presentation on the suffering of the lower realms. There we looked briefly at the intense suffering that beings are experiencing right now, whether they are suffering in the confusion of the animal realm, or the great pains of the hells and spirit realms, those beings are having to endure such what for us is unimaginable suffering due to the causes that they created, now having ripened into such a rebirth. Not wanting to have to experience that ourselves, we know those causes we have to avoid. Because as with everything in life, if there's something you want, particular result you want, you have to accrue those causes. If there's something you do not want, you ensure you do not accrue those causes.
Yeah. Adine, Helia, Kaji, Dongba Nila, Neba Neba, Gese Nes, Ledela Neba Majing, Nella Misiwani, Tony Yuko, Chinjulo to Soat is, Ne, Tony Guana ne, Tini, Tindi you don't Tony, Ledela Neba give you, Josu you are it is. In this. Hey, I cheated on. One.
Lama Tsongkhapa continues, some profess to have gained certainty about emptiness, yet do not have certainty about actions and their effects, nor even care about it. They have arrived at a mistaken understanding of emptiness, for if they had understood emptiness, they would see it to be the meaning of dependent arising, which would be helpful for gaining certainty about actions and their effects.
Lejela, never missing, see that in the Mikashet in the young race or that Tombani, some other Tombani, how was Tombani, said to me, Tombani, how we stole it, and Tenesam, some near, how close you get. That lady said him, never tend to your mother says, the easy match of Chungores. Personally, a deal right down to Tombani, like you. 大ရှင်这辈才那干年没把东沙去罗的，第二个罗，就是东沙东把的那些，就是那些来的有的些大些辈是年要买的，年没那的就要买的，就是的那什么大些呢，来些着了，那来的来着了，年把没要买的，这我都现在是还用过的些，什么用过的些。
This is certainly an error that one can fall into, thinking that one has understood emptiness, has had many teachings, reflected well, and come to a conclusion. Well, every time I investigate, looking for the essence by which something abides, I do not find it. Nothing exists by way of its own essence. This means also causes do not exist by way of their own essence. And if there's no such thing as a cause, how can there be a result? So here, through their so-called understanding of the presentation of reality, they come to dismiss the presentation of cause and effect, having no trust in it, feeling that their understanding of emptiness invalidates the presentation on cause and effect.
Yes, now the Tombani do part in Chivits and I near your mother, don't such but your mother Sungora. She's not calling the Tomba is that guy done Chibits, I don't such it. Is that doesn't Chibits in the lake, your mother, Miguel, your mother, lake, your minute, that Miguel made it. Jibu, to my hand, that Chibits, and mare or Tomba or your mother was. That is that the name that they let me lay down, give you Latin, as a Miguel Latin. Yung say yung mare said it. She's a person Tombani was. I didn't love you, go resident.
Such a person, then, will have investigated a wide number of phenomena. They've kept investigating and coming to the same conclusion. I find no essence or nature that establishes this phenomenon. It is empty of existing by way of its own nature or essence. So when I, when I look for a particular cause, a non-virtuous cause, I cannot find any essence or nature that establishes this as this non-virtuous cause. And if I look at a ripening result, I don't find in what is a so-called result any essence establishing this as a suffering result. So I see no cause, I see no suffering. When I investigate a so-called cause, I find just emptiness. When I investigate suffering, I just find emptiness. Therefore, I through my investigation process, have invalidated the presentation on cause and effect. There are no non-virtuous causes. There is no suffering.
Denege adusine gures de dene toma yugo chijulo so de tonye samda da no so is to God chijulo cha so de da tonyi da da ha wo yo ma de da tonyi yu dan da ha mo wa che dan da tonyi yu dan da di dok sho da samda sha de che za chijulo yu ba dan tonyi yu dan da da ha mo wa de is ko da.
As Lama Tsongkhapa writes, they have arrived at a mistaken understanding of emptiness. So their understanding of emptiness is actually the opposite. They've completely misunderstood the presentation of emptiness and come to a completely mistaken conclusion.
Denye tenze dondu tone reje la ngeba jebi gu zoso gu chiris chesan tonye wone ji tseme ngeba ye tonye ha ko to wa inna digi tenze gi donda ha ko re tenze gi donda tung ko re tenze gi donda ta de lenje gi namcha pe ya bo ha ko to re chesan digi tongba ye donda tenze gi namcha ha ko tenze gi namcha ha ko de le la ya pe ngeba shin de yeba shin ko re chesan da tonye dona digi topki 아니 렌데랑 해봐니 봐디 야고 쇼지리 거래 판도 거래마도 니 렌데 매봐 니 이마 셔바다 매와 요 말씀 배삼로도 용화 유리야 말 세상 렌데랑 해봐 시드니 해봐 예봐 지금 거래스 자다티 코로나섬 다데 돈이도 돈이 니에서 거라 하고 마 지주로 삼 파샤레스.
Lama Tsongkhapa continues, for if they understood emptiness, they would see it is the meaning of dependent arising, which would be helpful. Yeah, that part. So if they had actually understood emptiness, this would have come in. They would have seen that the meaning of emptiness and the meaning of dependent arising are harmonious. They are not at all contradictory. As one understands one understands the other. Therefore, as one understands emptiness, their understanding of causes and effects would deepen. The interdependent relationship between causes and effects, the understanding of that would deepen with their understanding of emptiness. So the understanding of emptiness should complement their understanding of the presentation of cause and effect. But that hasn't happened in this instance. And this shows their understanding of emptiness is deeply flawed.
동이 도바 동이 하고 도 동이 삼다에도 레균들이 민도 선배 삼을 단 거리 노트 침보레스 에자도 동이 원이 동이 하고나 이 하고나 이게 레균제 이 남샤 내가 깨리 신들의 핑거레스 내가 슈침을 깨토레스 제자디 거디 이지디 코란 동이 마토레스.
So with a mistaken understanding of emptiness, one can, as this person has done, ended up dismissing the presentation on cause and effect. However, with a correct understanding of emptiness, this will aid one's understanding of cause and effect.
Jeza andostine sumbore jeza dina shenjerim chigi tade namzo nana yorwa tine shaya nawi meta sewa tam tongbe ane yotas tongbe yotas session ne kazore shaya nawi yotas sewa tas tongbe meta session tongbanyi ane gyudan tibu chasu chewi tsushene tazin dewi cho mi yorwasi jezada tongbanyi do yodu anse kasore tenjige namsha nawi yotas session tenjige namsha yawu do yodu tene Andigi Yutan said, Korea said, Yuta says, Rang, good Gian Kalama, Rangon, to Yobadi, Pa, Gago, as sick, yes. That don't be meta says, don't buy your door, do, Chetamje, Ranchi, or strategy, Raji Maruna, Meru, recipe, Mevadi, and said, Meva member, you go about how to police or how to police. Then how go you do? The leg you dig in Namshad, Yapo Shuchi, chartudi yagush chagu es. Ini za hago edu dini tarzingi dawa dawigi dakitu ma es da chetamje ranshin tu yoba dawigi dawa da doshin disiki ma es shung. Na donda da ichiba chago dini.
And this very point what is also addressed by Lama Tsongkhapa in his three principal aspects of the path. And maybe it's the 13th verse. Moreover, appearance eliminates the extreme of existence. Also, emptiness eliminates the extreme of non-existence. And when you understand the manner in which causes and effects arise from within emptiness, you will no longer be robbed by the views of grasping at extremes. So those 4 lines from the 3 principal aspects of the path represent the same meaning as here. The first line, moreover, appearance eliminates the extreme of existence. So appearance refers to dependence arising. So when one understands dependence arising, one knows that phenomena do not exist by way of their own nature or essence, but rather they arise dependently. They arise dependent on causes or parts or labeling. So appearance, dependence arising, eliminates the extreme of existence, existing by way of its own nature. The second line, emptiness eliminates the extreme of non-existence. Because when one has understood emptiness correctly, one realizes that whilst phenomena are empty of existing by way of their own nature or essence, it doesn't mean they are non-existent. Rather, they do exist, just not in the way they appear to the mind. So the first line is about dependence arising. Moreover, appearance eliminates the extreme of existence. And the second line is emptiness eliminates the extreme of non-existence. So these two working together, and we see this here in our text, that the meaning of dependence arising is helped by the understanding of emptiness. So when one understands these two well, then the third line from the 3 principal aspects, when you understand the manner in which causes and effects arise from within emptiness. So in other words, causes are a dependent arising, as are effects, and they are both empty. So the cause can be a cause because it is empty of inherent existence, and effect can come about as an effect because it's empty of inherent existence. So when you understand then the harmony between dependence arising and emptiness, the 4th line, you will no longer be robbed by the views of grasping at extremes. And this person here, who has misunderstood emptiness, has fallen into an extreme view where they have abandoned cause and effect. They've abandoned the presentation of karma. So by understanding a harmonious relationship between dependence arising and emptiness, one understands cause and effect, and therefore one does not fall into wrong views such as this. So the verse one last time, moreover, appearance eliminates the extreme of existence. Also, emptiness eliminates the extreme of non-existence. When you understand the manner in which causes and effects arise from within emptiness, you'll no longer be robbed by the views of grasping at extremes.
Gala Matio Rang when you Dangalia Nang to check Haritamina, Shensi Lamatio Horn when you droop the version of the Nangore. Is that in now and I think you do Chine, Shimju Chevaji, the Contempilia. Gala Matio Rang when you droop the out in the middle, and big some ship Nigor. Just a Gala Matio Horn when you hear the body. Meva the hope or the hour do Toma said to Tongo, so that the other Tony to Gurwa. So then Kala Emma to a rango and to but in Mindo, something ever near the Tony to Gurwa, Eshirvada.
These two, the understanding of emptiness and the understanding of dependence arising, they should these two understandings should complement each other, the one enhancing the other. So to explain them both very briefly, dependent arising, it means that something is dependent on something else. So it can be expressed as one thing being dependent upon another, or there's a mutual dependency or an interdependency. But a dependence arising means something is dependent on something else. There's a relationship between them. One thing depends upon another. Emptiness, then, the meaning of that in brief is when we first come to recognize how things appear to our mind, whatever we think about appears to us as if it exists by way of its own nature, essence, or characteristic. In other words, there's something about whatever it is we're thinking about that makes it that, and it is that. So it appears to exist by way of its own nature or essence. But when we investigate, looking for this nature or essence that defines whatever it is we're thinking about, we cannot find that. It is empty of existing by way of its own nature or essence. And this is emptiness, empty of existing by way of its own inherent nature, or it's empty of existing by way of its own essence. So this is emptiness, empty of existing in the way that it appears.
Denige simju jedu kala marang ne duba meba tawgi ni meba ton sach ma to tongo marwa odo de ana che che ka le kunde sa da nga sa de ne yo mare besne de meba mare ga de dewa soju ge dewa nyoya da dunga nyoya da soso yo ba soso le ga le yo ba kala so sosu ge nyoye dugo ro da yo ba da hago yo ro da anda de ne inza da kala ma de ba gang change ma de ba gang to ba mindu that 자기네 매발에서는 that 소식이 여바든 용어 두도 와서 삼다이도 이네 어떤 강에 뭐도 랑은 원이 두바 강을 뭐도 랑은 원이 두바시 매나야 다 현실을 뛰네 팔려 따바점이도 선비가 하고 두고 그래시 디그 하고 될 때인데 참모세 하고 그래시
When one investigates, let's say, investigate reality first, one takes whatever object to mind, see how it appears, and then investigate to see if it exists in the way that it appears or not. And one will investigate in the various techniques that one is taught, and will come to recognize that it does not exist in the way that it appears. It is empty of existing in the way that it appears. Whatever the object is, it's empty of existing in the way that it appears. Nothing exists in the way that it appears to mind. And this recognition is a recognition or the realization of emptiness. That the self, the person, the self appears to what we appear to exist in a particular way, we investigate, cannot find it. Self is empty of existing in the way that it appears. But does that mean that what one searched for and couldn't find, therefore doesn't exist at all? Because if so, it would mean there is no self. There is no cause if one investigated a cause, or if one investigated a result. It would mean there is no result. But this is clearly not the case. Because, for example, the self, if I investigate the self and I don't find the self, and I find the self is empty of existing in the way that it appears, this cannot mean that the self or I do not exist, because here I am thinking. Here I am sitting. I am now not so hungry. Earlier I was hungry, so I was experiencing things. So how can I say I don't exist? But I am empty of existing in the way that I appear to my mind. So how do I exist then? Then one recognizes that phenomena, such as the self, exist merely labeled by mind as dependent arisings, dependent on the mind labeling or imputing or designating. This is how phenomena are said to exist. through the process of labeling by mind.
Na nyama etnici drumro shire bela impungo be jiguyabuven jiguyabu shirse that digi that to mongore ekasa digi down to the chola yorwa chola tomboni elechita elishni yores kwende yores yam ni michi toje 결혼이 뒤쳐라나라 가려 요래 라브레스 기스티브레스 졸라나라 가려 요스 기스티브레스 저 졸라니 요르와도 예니래 니여와 메지게 결혼 졸라나라 가려 요레스 기스티드 부디 렌자비드 졸라 디나마다 가이메스 졸라 디나로 가이메라기도 아르와다 야 돈다라 식디가선 졸라 디나로 가이메라도 디나지 예도 더 시거로 제가 졸라 디나로 가이메라레스 제가 딜라 가려스니 이 동바레라스 제가 졸라 디나라 가 메엘라도 시디기 도나 가르고 보스니 딜지 예도 더디 고어도 시거로와 예도 시거로와 제가 시디기 디나라 졸라 디나라 가 메엘라도 딜 예루지 예도 더 시고고로와 아저디 디고고로 그 시나에 디시거로와다
check.
아네 디 바이케이션
So, to the story from old Tibet about a particular very bright child. And there are actually many stories about this child. So in this story, the child was walking along and had two bags on each side of the child, one on the left and one on the right. And they met someone and who inquired, "What do you have in that bag?" So the child replied, "There's nothing in this bag." So from saying there's nothing in this bag, immediately it's clear he's implying that there must be something in the other bag.
ane nengo chidi dinala ane dinala garyorasni ditongbareslares
And then so the person that says, maybe a little curious, "Oh, so what's in the other bag?" And he said, "It is empty."
dondala karikuor sange she dondala te dila kana me labyodu cd nibale dene dele pashu yoba roch gotugor wa yo gogor wa dinashi 동바 니세 디기 donda karikuor선 동바 니세 디기 가야 메세 고고마 지기 여바를 고투고 동바 니세를 가 동바 니세 가서 강라야 마디어봐 라용원의 두바지 요마레 세스레고로 강라야 마디어바지 요마레 라면도 직되는 요레세 고투고레 세레 직디레 제사 될메 가야 메라도 델어 요바를 고고 디나시 강라야 마디어봐 라용원의 두바지 메스를 강라야 마디어바지 메라요도 지디다 소요도 되어바지 여바도 고고를 받아 제사 동반이 된디 동반이 된디 동반이 되니 된주가 되레스 된주가 돼 제사다 동반이 강라마도 랑원의 두 요마레스네 직파 제바지 하고에도 니기 시한을 되는 두바지 요레스 고투고레 제레다 제사 동이 되니 된주의 된도 통세디자 하고 두그레스.
So by the child saying, "There's nothing in this one," the child implied that there must be something in the other. And how the story then relates to what the subject at hand is that a learned and skilled meditator, when they understand emptiness, they realize dependent arising. Together with emptiness, the realization of emptiness. Because emptiness, this term emptiness, what should come to mind for this learned meditator would be it's empty of existing in the way that it appears by mind. That immediately implies something else, that it does exist in some way, just not in the way that it appears to my mind. So therefore, the way it appears to my mind, it doesn't exist in that way. That way of appearing is not how it exists in reality. So it implies there is something else, and that is the dependency on labeling.
제사다 동반이 있어 동반이 어디 강라에 마디가 랑원의 주버지 매스도 되는 주버 여바도 하고 그래 제사 동반 대유도 하고 와서 아직 딘진 저저 하고 최근에 신의 현실의 되는 주버 짱이 하고도 가서 현실의 마디가 주바디 매사하고 그래서 덴지게 남자 시연도 동 덴중 동배 된도 덴중의 남자 하고도 디들들 또 많이 하고 그래서 현실의 뛰는 주바지 최 아래 심도 제지 다 뛰는 주바마도 뛰는 주바 짜자하고 다 뛰는 주바마도 마트바 가라 마트바 저 있는 민도아 선배게다 동바인 하고 그래서 제가 디네기 덴중 동배 된다 동바 덴중의 된도 하고 사디디 제자데 동바니 도시네 내유도 때 동바 덴중의 된다 동바 안 덴중 동배 된도 곧 거래시래.
The skilled meditator will train themselves that whether they're meditating on emptiness, to then, when they realize emptiness, to also realize dependence arising, or if they're meditating on dependence arising, when they realize dependence arising, to also realize emptiness. The skilled meditator will have these two minds working in a complementary fashion, one following the other. So when they meditate on emptiness, they'll first see how the phenomenon appears to their mind, and then look for it to see if they can find this essence or nature, inherent nature that it appears to exist by. And when they come to the conclusion, I cannot find it, it is empty of existing in the way that appears to my mind, therefore it's merely labeled by mind. So emptiness leads to the realization of dependence arising. Therefore, it's empty of existing in the way that it appears to my mind, but it exists merely labeled by mind. Or if the meditation is done the other way, and they are investigating the phenomenon as a dependence arising, they'll come to the conclusion that it's dependent on causes, or it's dependent on parts, or it's dependent on labeling, and therefore, so they come to the realization of dependence arising, and therefore, because it's a dependent arising, it is empty of existing by way of its own inherent nature, because an inherent nature would necessarily be independent. So we haven't explained that meaning now, but that is how the realization of dependence arising would lead to the realization of emptiness. That because the phenomenon is a dependent arising, it cannot be independent, in other words, existing by way of its own nature.
어디서 돈이 거나서 돈이 또 바이나스 денис ден주의 돈도 통위에서 돈이 또한도 네 돈도 ден이 될때 안에 가서 제그 ден주의 돈도 이봐 또 ден주의 돈도 통위에서도 대신에 되는 주바디 여바데 하고 그래서 대통에 대통에도 다 레젤을 해봐 기리 해봐 기위 조차 그래서 다 동아시아디 동아시아디 뒤돈도 진짜 동아 여반자 대 현실을 뛰는 주반도 맞대바도 야야 말와스 진짜도 현실을 뛰는 주바 요요데스 진짜다 뛰는 주바서 가르 뛰고서는 디큐 미가발 뛰고래서 에 대화세디 대화도와 대화뇨아도와 예자디 그 직실 때를 두고래서 진짜 뛰는 주바다 디 때의 규리 가래 진짜 개발 용거래서 진짜 되게 돈이 또도 레규를 내가 신도 깨야다 근데 돈이 내가 니도 될라테네 샤리에 니제 하와도 니제 해 숙셔야 돼 용거래서
They will see the other people. It's
the thing is Chelsea that was the legal participate.
So just reading this final part again, this final sentence. For if they understood emptiness, they would see it to be the meaning of dependence arising. So in other words, realizing emptiness should induce their realization of dependence arising. And then it continues, which will be helpful for gaining certainty about actions and their effects, because causes and effect are necessarily dependence arising. For independence on a cause, an effect follows. An effect itself is dependence on a cause, looking at it in either direction. So in this way, emptiness aids one's understanding of dependence arising, which therefore should also aid one's understanding of cause and effect. But not only that, it also aids one's generation of compassion.
이제 라고 얘기하라 가는 스팽겨를 세리 지다다 내 윤지 지다다 제심전 코에 동안 용어에 되게 미겨와 미겨와를 때는 용어여 바디 미개와들이 용어가 타고로 와. 미개 와서야 돼. 그래서 메시바문 마리빨에 때네. 마리빨이 아니 왕게 내 디바사고로 와. 저자 대사다 닌제 심제 약혼들에 나와서 주님이도 뭐바 마리빨 마싱베 진게 레앙한 파사 레앙한 바 디왕게 콜 누아용을 차기도 와. 샘비게 되네게다. 제자 텐지게 남자디 도시 반 심쟁이 동안용타를 파삼 나치 셔바치유도 제자다 심쟁디게 파 동안용고 디교아데 동안 미게와 사바데 용 디아사바데 코 마신베 마리베 몽베 온게타 사비도 왔으면 제제 닌체세 단니지 하버드 게데 디용거래 닌치게
How then does this understanding of emptiness and dependence arising aid not only one's understanding of the presentation of cause and effect, but also that of compassion? Because when one has an understanding of emptiness and dependence arising, one has an understanding of reality. One understands that in dependence on particular causes, certain results will follow. And therefore, one understands that from virtue comes happiness, from non-virtue comes suffering. And the non-virtue is created by afflicted minds, which have as their very root, the foundational affliction is that of ignorance. In particular, the ignorance can either be the ignorance of confusion, so just a lack of knowledge, a lack of understanding of reality, or the ignorance of self-grasping, where one misconceives reality, misperceives reality. So this is the position that sentient beings find themselves in. They have no free will. They do not intentionally create the causes that keep them bound in cyclic existence. Rather, their confusion is so overwhelming, their ignorance is so completely blinding, that even despite them thinking what they're doing is good, all too often it is not, and they're creating the causes for their perpetuating of their process of birth and death in cyclic existence. So this is the very foundation for the generation of actual compassion, which is understanding this process by which beings keep themselves bound in samsara.
민갑자 총총보치기쇼 세상 미치게 동동 미나 동동 세디 민갑게 서에게 삼다요도 제자 정신세바 켄요도 딱고 민갑게 서바 능갑게디 소매 바치다 강아 지치코팅ning 제선비 니지게다 강갑게 미서바는 코서바는 딱 콜리아 민갑게 서비 디버사 디기다 녀와로 동아 바도 매바 녀와친데 코 동아디네 강아 시우녀와 시우녀고 바디 디니게 시요도 하바도 니 시우시게제네 that 코 디디 동아 셈진 민갑게디 네 소레 타야다 코롱 안 마오바는 예비 동아 용 먹어야게 근데 동아디 아니 용이 sab이 도체 이제 하버드 기체네 근데 바 미치 쇠로 쇠샤마레스 숭어요와 제가 이제 하버드 기와 디시리 가서는 그 유다 긴 차사 디체도 동아빠도 매번 차사 통화도 이제 하버드 기고래 근데 제가 마토는 건 이제 하버드 기고 세상 아주 미션의 동안이야 토에도 이제 내가 도왔으면 지호 소화실에 도움다 그래서 그다지 강아 연구요거들 세부도 하고 마토로와 전에 하고 투엔들이야 되게 미세이다 토알마소나 되게 이제 체리 도에 서와 제가 되네자 동반이기 동반이나 된디게 남자한테 하고 된디게 남자스도 레근디게 남자한테 삼다에도 되게는 샘철이야 이제 하버드 기 쇼체기도 그래서 디스코물.
And Wednesday night's teaching on Shantidevas gauging in the Bodhisattva's way of life, I've recounted the story of the Bodhisattva merchant who was one of 500 merchants on a ship, and with their clairvoyance was aware that the ship captain, as they're approaching port, wanted to kill all 500 merchants, including Bodhisattva, so as to claim all their wares. So then with this recognition, strong compassion arose, and the Bodhisattva tried to overpower and eventually had to kill the captain. So the motivating factor behind this activity was genuine compassion, knowing that this captain was about to create the causes for intense suffering over an immeasurable period of time in the hells. So out of genuine compassion for the suffering that captain was about to create, the Bodhisattva took this aggressive or violent action against the captain. So for ourselves, we have a very different response when we see harm being perpetrated. We do not immediately have a deep understanding of the causes that the perpetrator of harm is creating, and that whilst they may be in a position of dominance and power right now, they are going to be suffering for an inconceivable period of time in ways that are for us unimaginable. But someone who has understood cause and effect very well, this is how they will relate to what they observe.
Oh yeah, ini zatang ju kanjeli le kunje dang du samda dang de rakwa di yeng de ha go borwa jida de ha go da benga juge jike migai samlosh da shen chilia konrish la che an pha chi su shebe na an chule chu su shebe de table lamsa ji chung ba rakwa di yeng juge din ha go do borwa jena ani a jige yang jige pebe samli thone shen je lo ro chebe na 남자 파저디处理 제보들이야 소수야 거우제다 병아제나 숨다돼 리레비 제보디라고 되게나 자우도로 지선 참모참모디 인하다 아우도 말로 예인자 디나 신진도 진행하도 심주신에 얘기 예대게 남자들이야 양내양도 삼다 김제 삼다 아니야 제 레군이 남샤 손주비에 배치다 되는 걸로 도 치네 양내양도 도 치네 제바 삼다 도 제바 있는다가 레군이 남샤디 아니 yes, sometimes you didn't sometimes that time so you gave you 있으면 좋겠네. 자와 가르치는 어디지는 gave 미기를 차루도 제자디치 말에 지켜 말해서 받소냐다. 어디지는 기회에서 개월이샤디 좀 내야고도 와서 베게 삼다제모도 죽어야지 된 라레데디 계셔봐. 샤브라디링에 당어도 쉬어야 되는 시 상이된 마음도 쉬어야 돼.
So all of us, we have an understanding of cause and effect, tends though to be rather coarse. We have an understanding of that this is virtuous, this is non-virtuous, but this understanding we need to deepen. We need to deepen so that we recognize that harmful thoughts, firstly, that we need to have the mindfulness to be aware of our thought patterns and recognize that harmful thoughts or afflicted thoughts only lead to suffering, particularly if we then express them and we bring suffering to others. And likewise, we have a recognition, and we need to enhance this, that with a virtuous motivation, when we help others, either directly or indirectly, we are creating virtue. And then we can utilize this knowledge of virtuous karma to rejoice in what we do, in the virtue that we do, and seek out further opportunities to engage in virtue. So whatever level of knowledge we have of cause and effect, we need to work with this, but not be complacent with that, satisfied with that. We need to deepen it further. In particular, we need to deepen our integration of our understanding of cause and effect, so that we develop a deep barrier within against non-virtue, so that it becomes inconceivable for us to think or speak or act in ways which are non-virtuous. And coming together with this, a ever-broadening, opening up to habituation to virtuous ways of thinking, speaking, and acting, so that these become what define us as our personality, this wholesome, virtuous way of acting. And non-virtuous inclinations, they become completely abandoned and become alien to us. This is how, or to the extent, we need to deepen our understanding of the presentation on cause and effect. So we'll continue then tomorrow from here, where we conclude tonight, and continue to look at the presentation.